Hello and welcome to Focus 54, your weekly guide to real African news. I am your host, Jeffrey Murimbechi. We will be talking and casting an eye and a spotlight on the SADC Summit, which will be hosted by Zimbabwe in August. And while that is happening, Zimbabwe will assume the chairmanship of the SADC region through the president, Dr. Mnangagwa. But before we touch on that, let's touch on the top stories that are affecting the continent of Africa. The big story: on the 3rd of April, Zimbabwe declared a drought, the 2023-2024 season, induced by the El Nino effect and a weak summer cropping season. And this was announced by the president, Dr. Mnangagwa, and he has called on for more than $2 billion United States dollars that are needed to help the country with various interventions. And this has not only affected Zimbabwe, but other countries such as Malawi and Zambia.
My dear Zimbabweans, the foregoing situation of the climate change-induced drought requires measures and interventions as provided for in our laws. To that end, I do hereby declare a national state of disaster due to the El Nino-induced drought. Accordingly, I now invoke Section 27, subsection 1 of the Civil Protection Act, Chapter 10,06. By this declaration, I also call upon all Zimbabweans of goodwill, including those in the diaspora, the international community, United Nations agencies, development and humanitarian partners, international financial institutions, the private sector, churches and other faith-based organizations, as well as individuals, to generously donate towards ameliorating this state of national disaster. Preliminary assessments show that Zimbabwe requires in excess of $2 billion towards various interventions we envisage in the spectrum of our national response to the disaster.
We turn to Senegal, where Senegal inaugurated its fifth president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, on Tuesday, ushering a new era of democracy and hope. The 44-year-old was elected, and after mass protests and deadly clashes following former President Sall's attempts to delay elections, the event, attended by Faye supporters, was a moment of healing, expression of the Senegalese citizens, with them hoping for justice for those that have lost their lives through protest and brighter prospects for the country. We move to the east of Africa and we go straight to Kenya, where the healthcare crisis is escalating as doctors, medical interns and students continue to strike, calling for better pay, compensation of medical coverage and the implementation of a 2017 collective bargaining agreement. And the Kenyan government must urgently address the demands of the striking professionals to avert a full-blown healthcare crisis and ensure the well-being of its citizens. We go up north to Egypt, where Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is facing mounting domestic challenges and a strained economy that has sworn in for the third six-year term after a largely unchallenged election. El-Sisi, who came to power after overthrowing Morsi in the year 2013, has ruled Egypt with an iron fist, and a recent re-election secured with no significant opposition reflects a narrowing political space under his leadership, and we will be touching more on that as the year progresses. We turn to Somalia finally, where the tension between Somalia's central government and its semi-autonomous state of Puntland has reached a critical point. Now, Puntland has withdrawn from the federal system in protest of the recent constitutional changes, in which it views as undemocratic and overly centralized. This move by Puntland puts a further strain to an already volatile political landscape and jeopardizes Somalia's efforts towards stabilization and unity. This is a total contrast to what's happening within the SADC region, and we'll be talking about the SADC Summit as we have our guest in studio, a political scientist, Richard Mahomva. So do join us for the second and third segment of Focus 54. Welcome back to Focus 54 in the second segment, and this time I'm not alone. We are going to be talking about the SADC Summit, which is scheduled for August, and I am joined by a political scientist, no stranger to these matters, Richard Mahomva. Good to have you on Focus 54.
Thank you for having me, and highly appreciated.
And we really truly appreciate your contributions, your continuous study on these matters. And the big one now, Zimbabwe is preparing to host the 44th SADC Summit, and that's happening in August. In your view, what are the implications and key matters that will be discussed this year?
Before we delve into the key matters, I would like to walk you back to history. You would recall very vividly that Zimbabwe played a very pivotal role in the birth of what we call SADC today. It was senior civil servants from Zimbabwe that provided the technical framework that gave birth to SADC. And fast forward decades later, it was Zimbabwe that was also instrumental in spearheading economic policies that actually offended the ego of neoliberalism, that is through the land reform program, and it attracted so much adversity that came with sanctions and all of that. So Zimbabwe, when all has been said and done, he has been this think tank of integration of the region. He has been this think tank of these enduring values of Pan-Africanism from the southern bit of the continent. Now, fast forward, you have got this SADC Summit coming against the backdrop of a transitional phase where we have got a new president. It actually shows that Zimbabwe is carrying the institutional memory of Pan-Africanism from a Southern African perspective, that the institutional framework that was set by the former head of state is being continued by his predecessor, by his successor and his student. And most importantly, it speaks to how SADC is returning to the source,
so now,
Zimbabwe.
The gesture of President Mnangagwa assuming the chairmanship of SADC, let's talk about how that fosters greater unity and continuity and collaboration within the region.
For starters, if you want to analyze Emmerson Mnangagwa, the person, he belongs to the first generation of nationalists that actually paved the path for the freedom that you saw in Zambia. You'd recall as early as 1962, he was with UNIP. He was also part of the first group that trained. So he carries this institutional memory, and he's a nationalist senior in the region. And therefore,
so that means the other presidents respect him for all of that as well?
No, precisely. That is the historical protocol that comes with his luminary personality as a nationalist, and that aspect of Zimbabwe being a think tank of the transitional phases of the African liberation question, Zimbabwe spearheading the land reform. And it is under Emmerson Mnangagwa that SADC found it worthy to actually call for the unconditional removal of sanctions on August 2019. And this has become a phenomena that has been even escalated to the continental level. So he is this effigy of Africa's resistance to the ever-changing complexities of neocolonialism, and is the torchbearer of that particular aspect of Africa's true redemption. And it is under Emmerson Mnangagwa that Zimbabwe's economic transformation, Zimbabwe's social transformation is predicated on a timeline perspective, hence the Vision 2030, which also relates with the aspect of the African continental free trade area of creating a seamless avenue of trade within the continent. Mm-hmm. And when he says Zimbabwe is open for business, he is resituating Zimbabwe as that hub that can facilitate the trade across the continent. And it is no coincidence that under Emmerson Mnangagwa, the ports of entries are being, revived and rehabilitated, mm-hmm. because he has got that regional focal aspect to development.
Now, you've clearly clarified Zimbabwe's position, yeah. and how the pioneer generation of nationalists, Pan-Africanists, if I could also add to that, yeah. Looking at the region, looking at Africa as a whole, 10 years ago or so, when you hear about African elections, it was all violence, it was all of things like that. Zimbabwe had an election, it went on very well, the template seems to be shared. We have a lot of African countries that have elections this year. Within the region, we've got South Africa and Mozambique having elections this year. How important is SADC's role? And leading up to this summit, how important would this be?
So the first point that arises is that there were so many aspersions that were cast on the government and ZANU-PF in particular immediately after the resounding victory of ZANU-PF. And there was a perspective that SADC was raising concerns and all of that. But the fact that the SADC Summit is actually happening in Zimbabwe, it is a seal of endorsement on the outcome of the election. That is number one. But also, like I said, Zimbabwe has been a think tank of how electoral transitions ought to occur. You will concur with me that yourselves in the media gave fair airplay to all players. You would concur with me that you in the media also gave an opportunity to all candidates to speak out, except for a few that didn't find comforts to go against their common lies of saying ZBC does not, create avenues of good communication. But again, you'd also look at how the election was managed. Of course, there were challenges around ballot delays and all of that. And there were aspersions that were also brought around that perspective to say, so the ballots, delayed and it was a ploy to manipulate the elections. But those particular places where the ballots delayed, you had a situation whereby the party that was alleged of rigging did not even win. So it's some of those dynamics that also emerge. And then across the border, you've got elections in South Africa, and it's elections that are coming against the backdrop of the internal contradictions in the ANC. You now have a factional outfit that is being led by another luminary, and it points out to the extent to which there are these internal revolutionary contradictions across the continent.
Do they address these at SADC level? Because I will tell you that the Mozambican government is calling on to its citizens who are staying in Zimbabwe and in other parts of the SADC region to register at the embassies, various points, to be able to vote from. For me, it sounds like bilateral collaboration. In terms of SADC, how much does SADC have a voice in the Mozambican election as a body, as well as the South African election, to say, look, to what extent can they have their voice as a regional body?
Yeah, before I come to that question, I would want to exhaust this very important point to say you are seeing the contradictions that are happening in South Africa. And in Zimbabwe, you are seeing a very different state of affairs. So it also shows the extent to which the Revolutionary Party in Zimbabwe is very compact, and that the template should actually be replicated elsewhere in the continent. And then what is the voice of the SADC? Yes, the SADC is a very credible body. This is why our government found it fit to engage SADC to be part of our election observer team, and the prescriptions that SADC puts across are prescriptions that are listened to. And of course, in some instances, there could be excesses and omissions that could be manipulated by reactionaries, but that does not discredit the function of the SADC. It is also in that same spirit that progressive citizens like myself and others have got so much confidence in institutions like ZEC, and we respect their constitutional legitimacy. The same way Zimbabwe also submits itself to multilateral institutions. But with that same token, you have got perennially adverse multilateral institutions that have constantly used, our past contradictions with the rest of the global north. I'm talking about your EU, I'm talking about some hostile embassies. They always have certain positions, but SADC is that one family space whose opinions really can guide us, and we can also have our inputs through mutually respectful terms.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I must say that on the 3rd of April 2024, the President of Zimbabwe, Dr. Mnangagwa, declared that the 2023-2024 season as a drought. And it's not only isolated to Zimbabwe, it's also affecting Malawi as well as Zambia. We'll be talking about this and SADC input in the third and final segment. Welcome to the third and final segment of Focus 54, and I am joined by political scientist Richard Mahomva. Richard, now we have a situation within SADC ahead of the SADC Summit hosted by Zimbabwe in August. Zimbabwe has declared a drought, so has Malawi and Zambia. 3 members of the SADC bloc have been severely affected, and you know it affects the entire region. What will SADC do?
I would like to give a context to your question. Last year, I had the privilege to participate in COP28. There was an African lamentation on the effects of climate change. So what is going on in Zimbabwe, what is going on in Malawi, what is also going on in certain parts of even South America is quite expressive of the global south's climate vulnerability, climate decimation, climate victimization, and it's a rallying point for countries in the global south to say, what can we do about this? And given Zimbabwe's astute thought leadership, we are saying this is an opportunity for us to say, yes, back at home we've got this challenge, but how do we evoke that acquired political soul of Pan-Africanism to have collective solutions around the drought? And we are saying President Mnangagwa set the trademark policy framework of Pfumvudza. And imagine if we import that very same concept of agroecological tailoring to our neighbors. What would it mean to our collective fight against hunger? What would it mean to our collective fight against this global north perpetuated and perpetrated climate victimization?
So are you saying that SADC within its member states, within its collective thinking, can mitigate the droughts that are affecting all the areas within itself without external help? Is it possible?
It's very much possible, because Zimbabwe, you'd recall that last year, the last year's season and the preceding year, we actually had our agroecological tailoring, Ketes of Pfumvudza, which made it possible. And had it not been for the climate assault that we're going through, we're going to have a very good season. And the fact that the president has taken a very transparent position to say this is where we are, it means that he's foresighted to even create solutions. And I believe that SADC has got that capacity to collectively do things within its capacity. But of course, there are institutions like your World Food Program, they could be engaged. But I'm one who is for the idea that African solutions should precede external interventions. And I think Africans have got the urgency and the intellectual acumen to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Richard, for clarifying that. And I know that you've, above all things, you have brought how important it is to have the summit, especially in Zimbabwe, with the chairmanship of Zimbabwe through our president, Dr. E.D. Mnangagwa. This is going to be a very interesting summit, so one of a kind, one that we will not ignore, and we'll have many of these current affairs, political minds, legal minds that will be a part of this. But do give us your thoughts and feedback on our Facebook page, that is ZBC News Online. And unfortunately, time is a resource that we cannot manipulate, and hopefully we'll have a second session focusing on the SADC Summit. For Focus 54, I am Jeffrey Murimbechi. Catch me on the next episode.